He says at one point in the film, I'm a rebel. Why am I not a rebel? One of the women in the film says, you're a psychotic. And he goes, well, you say tomato, I say tomato. I mean, who's to say? Well, the thematics of presenting that possibility, an apocalyptic one, as a hopeful one, it only can be hopeful if structurally there's a greater danger than even dying. At least in an apocalypse, everyone would die, and we'd all die. You'd see other people, and you'd be one of them, and there'd be the real embodied feel of it. But to die, to be in a situation where you're unable to die, but trapped in this cycle of despair, which Kierkegaard talks about, which, to refer back to Marx, Weber, and others, may be no more nor less than just the cycle of our boring daily existence without projects beyond these limited ones I've named. Getting a boat, getting some new shoes, resoling the Reeboks, getting the kids in the right school. Under such conditions, moments may arise, Kierkegaard argues, in which, when we really face ourselves, the hope would be to find a way to die. Doesn't mean you couldn't commit suicide, but that wouldn't even solve it. You'd be too worried. You'd say, what will the kids do after I'm gone? See, that wouldn't solve it either. Because what has structured you is this despair. It is you. That's again why we have a lot of therapists, but they can't fix this Kierkegaardian problem. It is not a mere psychological problem. It is a structural condition of the self. My argument here is that under our modern conditions, it is quite general. So apocalypse movies, on this kind of account, will give us a social compensation for this inability, for this despair, and they'll also give us a thrill. Things could be otherwise. There could be the big bomb after all. I mean, it's joked about. It should be, in a way. It's one way to express this very despair. It's joked about. The more frightening movies, as I say, are movies like Blade Runner, where a very near future is presented, in which you, like all other commodities, will be recycled. Where that is the greater danger, not to die a death in despair, but to live a life that's not human. The real danger is one that was summarized beautifully by a theologian friend of mine at Duke. The old problem of theology, which has always been closely connected to philosophy, as you may know, the old problem was the unbeliever, the non-believer. The new problem is the non-person. This Kierkegaard had already had a foretaste of. It isn't the problem of people not believing, it's the problem of finding people. Are there people? Do we want to call these beings that are walking around people? And that can't, and I don't want to make this sound elitist, that can't be said from a standpoint separate from you being one of them. You know, raised in the same televised culture, where the simulated images of the real are just as real, sometimes more real than real. I mean, it is not a problem about which one can be an elitist in any sense, because it is quite generally a social malady, in much the way that the massive support for the war now could be understood as a social malady of a certain kind, like shell shock, the reaction of people struggling to be sane in insane conditions. Despair, the reaction of people struggling to be human in inhuman conditions. But the answer to this is not to... all the psychologists can do, if you go to them, I mean, it's not all, it's a pretty good thing. If you don't want to worry about this kind of thing, despair, losing your humanity, there are drugs. And I'm not talking now about the just say no kind. Those are, as we know, for the lower classes. There are middle-class drugs that can be prescribed to you legally that, as it were, handle these existential worries. Valium's one. In Don DeLillo's novel, Dialar is an even better version. It totally kills the fear of death. Just pop one pill and just shuts off the electrochemical things that make you despair, fear death, have anxiety. Valium already, I think, is... well, it's been replaced, though, by a whole series now, right, of designer tranquilizers. I mean, it's still the major general one, but now they're designer tranquilizers. Well, there's a point here, a very deep one. We've been tracing throughout here a series of human projects, and yet we have not yet faced the greatest danger. That if the story of the development of society in the 19th century in its broadest sense was the replacement of manual labor by machine labor in the advancing countries of the world, the story of the 20th century will surely be in part and in broad strokes the replacement of intellectual labor, thinking, and even feeling and emoting by machine labor. How much of that has already occurred? I'm not up here to spin a science fiction story for you. Well, we already have near future movies that project cyborgs and stuff, but we also have actually technically built virtual reality suits. We have hosts of designer drugs. We have TV and movie stars that redesign their bodies, that redesign their iconic images, that come out with a different kind of soul. For example, Michael Jackson. We couldn't decide whether he was Diana Ross. At one time he kind of looked like Diana Ross, one of the young Jacksons, a Motown singer, or a Walt Disney star, because he is re-whittled, reshaped. Now, in terms of this whole discourse we've had about what humans are and their values as they develop historically, probably the greatest danger in the final situation that might be faced is what's left of the human at all under modern conditions. What is left to talk about in this dimension. And in that situation, you have to face squarely this problem that Kierkegaard, I have to say with some nostalgia, called despair, because it's just as common today to find people who are giddy over the current situation. I mean, really, they write books called The Ecstasy of Communication, about how wonderful it is to be an image rather than a person. Let me try to make this, get back to a West Texas level with this so you can follow me. For Reagan, it was so much more convenient to be an image than a person. Real person like him's kind of a drag, semi-good actor. Semi-good. He was good in that one movie where they cut off his legs. Made him shorter, for one thing. Magnificent as an icon. Great TV icon, which was his function. You know, and I know, that he couldn't run a government. That's not debatable. Just like a cabbage can't drive a BMW. We don't debate issues like that. What was important about him was his iconic significance. It was more real than real. See, FDR was a real president. Real. FDR's all these sort of embodied things about him. He's wheelchaired and tied down, sort of the feel, the real about him. With Reagan, his telematic image was sort of more real than even real. It sort of transcends even our notions of limited reality because, well, the famous Hollywood phrase, larger than life. That's what we say about screen figures. He was larger than life, by which I suppose we mean he was dead. And in a sense, it was totally irrelevant, because as long as the images kept flowing and some other hack actor could dress up like him to show up and wave under the noise of the helicopters, it mattered not. In a society, and this is the point I'm making, in a society where images count to that extent, what it means to be a subject, what it means to try to find a project, gets to be re-understood in terms of what it means to find the right place to buy the clothes, the best place to go to school, the right kind of accent to use, and who to get to know. It becomes a matter of fashion. For Kierkegaard, that was rather despairing. He thought that humans driven to such an extent, driven to that extent of socialization, hyper-socialization, would greatly prefer death, but would be pretty much unable to pull the thing off. Just like the young man in Heathers doesn't quite get around to blowing up the high school, and the young audience is very disappointed that he doesn't. Everyone that I talked to saw the film. All the young people went, well, it would have been so much better if he'd have blown it up. I mean, we did want a Woodstock for the 90s. It would have been real. It would have been, send a message to the whole country. Well, this is where we reach, as it were, a sort of limit on what we can do in terms of either social theory or human values, and that's where we begin to discuss the possible disappearance of the subject of that discourse, the human. And if human beings were constituted in what they physically did and what they thought, which seemed to be what we were talking about for most of the course, right? Then if in the 19th century we began to replace physical labor with machine labor, and now every home has a PC that's smarter than any of us used to be, and mental labor becomes replaced, what functions are left over for humans to perform becomes really problematic. It becomes really problematic. Now, the despairing way to look at it is that we've become useless. However, that's only in the scale of values I've been criticizing. In other words, we would become useless in the sense that they don't need our labor. That's the scale of value I've been criticizing. And I think part of the giddiness of this situation within which the need for humans to do certain things is becoming erased in society through the advance of capitalism, technology, if you want to put it in a cheap way. The other side of that is the giddiness of the possibility of freedom. I mean, after all, freed from manual labor doesn't sound so bad. Freed from mental labor doesn't sound so bad, especially given the boring kinds computers do. You know, computers do a lot of bookkeeping and a lot of number stuff. And who in the hell likes that? Well, I mean, you know, there may be someone who does, but they can still do it as a hobby, you know. If they've got to keep some books, they can still do it. But the other side of this social system, which seems, as it were, to squash out what was understood as human values, and I mean now even in the broadest sense, insofar as humans thought something, did something, begins to squash that out. The other side of it is the need for the necessity of some of these things disappears and leaves open possible projects of freedom again, but at another level now. What those would look like, what they would be like, would be much different. They can't really be talked about, just like the social situation I'm trying to describe is difficult to evoke, because we're in the middle of it. You know, it's always hard to evoke the present because you're in it. It's kind of like the aquarium fish trying to describe the aquarium. I mean, it's home. You know, here I am. But what we would need and what we cannot have, in my view, is a view from outside the aquarium, so looking at it where its limits are and its boundaries. In this situation, the one I'm describing now, and trying to connect up now is the third part of my social account, and the scariest probably for me, is the culture that many of you have heard this word, the culture, which is postmodern. I think we have a very modernist economy still, a very modernist state. But when you hear the phrase postmodern culture, one of its reference is a culture based on spectacles and images that have become more real than the real thing, where Madonna is more real than your real lover, where the real thing is not God but Coca-Cola. Coke is it. You know, it. Pierce, that's a strong claim. It. I mean, what do you get to be more than that? It. It's almost like a Hindu religion. This is the cultural aspect of society, and culture is very important because it's where we draw our meanings from and our identities. It's in a culture that we learn how to speak a language, what our identities are. In a totally commodified culture, I mentioned, phone sex and other things. In a totally commodified culture, it's hard to decide whether you have just adopted a fashion or you're developing as a person. In fact, how you could argue between the two becomes very difficult in a culture like ours. Does it mean more than you now jog and do diet pills? Does it mean something more? It becomes difficult to say what more that is. That attempt to articulate meaning finds all these bizarre outlets. Shirley MacLaine's chakras. I mean, people watch that on TV without just bursting not in laughter, but either in laughter or tears, because when you're driven to that extreme to find some meaning, then your condition is a sickness unto death. If you're driven to that extreme to find meaning, when the only warmth you can get is to cuddle up by a flag that you're all too cynical to really believe in, that's long gone, and we all know it. The new patriotism is a cynical one in a way. We know better now, but we just have to forget that we know better. When that's your comfort, is to go into that as a kind of new lifestyle. It's sort of like yuppieism is over in greed. There must be something to give meaning. Oh, there is. I forgot about the flag. Well, what's next? Well, maybe baseball. We'll have a, they made a bunch of baseball movies. Maybe everybody will get back into baseball. The point here is that what these things are don't look like human choices or human values anymore, but human commodities, things you can buy. I mean, you can't walk in a 7-Eleven without being able to buy a piece of identity. We all know that when you put on a hat that says Lone Star Beer, you've bought a kind of identity, but no less so than when you show up at Harvard in your little wool sweater. They code certain kinds of identities, and the fear is that beneath them, what we've understood and discussed in here as human values have been, as it were, dried up by the very ability to market them, by the ability to turn them into goods for sale, and worse than that, into images and into cultural products, of which each one of us has the trouble of saying, as I say, why we're not one. How could I not be aware of this as we film this, right? Because I have no control over the image production in a certain sense, and even the people who film and so on, it goes beyond that. We're in a telematic world in that sense, where you can have a revolution in Beijing, have the pictures over here in 2 minutes, and then forget about it in a month, and 3 months later have one of the people on the Phil Donahue show. That kind of society produces different kinds of people. The question is whether we still want to call them that or not. At a certain point, we don't. I don't. Anyway, this is my view. When they reach, I call it the DQ threshold, the Dan Quayle threshold. Beneath that, I cease to give an analysis of human values or the subject. Beneath that threshold, I am dealing with what Descartes called cleverly constructed automatons, dealing with people without affect. In other words, they can fake affect. They can pretend to be moved, but can't be moved.